Hi everyone, and welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. I'm your host, Paige Fullman. Today, we're digging into something that feels more slippery than ever, the truth. In an era where facts are up for debate and lies get headlines, the role of media has never been more critical, or more complicated. When I first connected with today's guest, I shared something that's been bothering me for a while. The way the media often stops at he or she said this, even when what's said is demonstrably false. And what they should be saying is he or she said this, and it's completely inaccurate. We treat falsehoods like just another side of the story instead of calling them what they are. So how do we fix that? How do we get back to a world where truth is not just respected, but shared and understood? To help us unpack all of that is Jenny Abamu. Jenny is a working journalist whose reporting and analysis has appeared across both local and national platforms, including NPR, Fortune Magazine, WAMU, EdSurge, CBS, ABC, Yahoo News, Motherly, and more. A former U.S. diplomat, she served in Saudi Arabia and Spain, gaining unique insights into disinformation, global politics, and cultural complexity. The Herd, When Democracy Falls, is her debut fiction novel exploring the collapse of democracy under the weight of disinformation and fractured truth. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Jenny. Jenny, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you on.
I'm so excited to be here, Paige.
I know you just released your book called The Herd, and I read it, and I loved it. So I'm really excited that you are able to come on and talk about it and, kind of the themes around that and how that relates to our broader world as it is now.
I'm really excited to be here and definitely excited to talk about the book. So thank you for reading. And I love hearing the feedback that people are getting from the book.
Good. I'm happy. I'm wondering if we could start out talking about media and how it shapes collective memory and, as you phrased it, national identity post-crisis. We're coming out of COVID. Media has been a huge talking point coming out of that. So how do you see media shaping collective memory in the aftermath of national or global crisis?
So this is fascinating because there's a lot of global crises that are happening at this time. And so there are a lot of things that are going. I think one thing I always like to remind people is that the media, the journalists, the reporters on the ground, they are learning as people are learning. And so we have this story about the elephant where everyone's, looking at the elephant and they see it from their angle and they see a different thing because they're only seeing from their little angle. And I think as national crises unfold, that is a similar thing to what reporters deal with. They're on the ground, but they're not able to have this hindsight that a lot of people often have when they critique the media about what's happening in the moment. And so what they offer is what they can see from their perspective. And so, I think at the moment we're looking at a situation where a lot of people, there's been some really intense crises, COVID, the Gaza war, all kinds of things that are happening. And the people have a lot of critiques for what the media has done and what they haven't done, but they also have a lot of it is hindsight critique. And so to me, I try to be fair in that I don't believe in the media as people speak of it. I know it's not true in a sense that everyone is co-opting together in this conspiracy to tell this specific narrative. I don't think I don't think that's the case at all. Media is actually very fractured and highly competitive and not cooperative in the best of times, even within your own newsroom. And so the concept that we would all be cooperating in a very large way outside of the newsroom is kind of crazy. But I do think in general that it is understandable that people think that the story is not what they think it should be. But that is oftentimes a hindsight perspective as opposed to being in the moment telling that story, which is hard.
I'm now thinking of I've never really thought about it before, but the fact that, there are lots of people that think all these big media companies are, collaborating together. And I've never thought about that before, but now I'm thinking of MSNBC and CNN and all of the big news organizations just sitting in a boardroom and being okay, so what are we, all 8 of us collectively, going to push the narrative about? Which sounds insane. No, duh, they're not doing that.
It's and I get why people think that, okay? Because I used to work the media desk. So my job has mostly been in local, but I've done national stories too. And I get it. We think why does everyone cover the same story? Why are we all obsessed with the same thing and this kind of narrative? And there is a herd mentality to the media. And that's why I call the book The Herd, because there is this kind of, you need to be there at that story or you're doing something wrong. If you're so I used to work the assignment desk, which is a place where you send reporters to go cover stories in New York City. And in New York, there's going to be a list of like 40 things happening at every given moment. And you have to decide what is the most important thing on that list to send your reporter to. And you don't want your reporter to be at some random story when everybody else is at some other story. And then you at the assignment desk look like an idiot because you sent your reporter to the thing that didn't matter or mattered less than what everybody else is saying matters. And so there is that herd mentality, because I know like if I used to freak out and be like, oh my God, my news director is going to come and chew me out for picking the wrong story and everybody else is at the other story. And so, yeah, that herd mentality exists. But are we cooperating? No, we are competing. And so it's not a cooperative effort. It's more of like, I don't want to get like somebody yelling at me and looking at me like I'm an idiot.
Right. Well, feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like another part of it is the media covers stories that are verifiable. Like they're not going to cover stories that are not verifiable and in some cases outright lies. So when all those like tweets show up where it's like, why isn't the media reporting on this? I don't know, Sharon. Maybe because they couldn't verify anything about it.
And very true, right? Are you trying to get sued? You know, like, are you trying to be the one
right.
in litigation? Not really a thing, you know. It's like, I mean, I've heard terrible stories from people. I believe what they're saying, but if I can't verify that story with at least 3 sources and one needs to go on record, then no, I can't report that story. Even if I believe what you're saying, I think it's a terrible thing. There are lawyers that are at our station that go over everything that I print and that have to review all of that stuff. And they say, what's the source? How do you verify it? Usually the standard practice is at least 3 sources per fact. And so you're going through this whole process of, even if it sounds true, if you're that one guy who's saying it, and maybe you're pretty resourceful person, it would take a lot for somebody to print it.
Right. And I think, a lot of people don't really realize that that's the reality of what goes on. And so I feel like a lot of people are going to listen to that and go, wait, really?
Well, yeah. And people are litigious. This is America. Like the recourse for news is not necessarily putting someone in jail when you do something wrong. People will sue you. They'll sue the station. Oftentimes they sue the station because it has more money than the individual reporter, but right. You can also be sued too. So you have to kind of consider all of those things every time you write something, every time you publish.
Right. So moving on, in your experience as a journalist and also a former diplomat, how does the media contribute to building or also in some cases fracturing national identity during political instability?
This is a very big question, but I think it's a huge and important question because it's a hard thing to kind of do now, because as a country, we generally have these shared values, right? Like we have freedom. We agree on that. Democracy, we agree on that. These shared Western values, following the law, we agree that the law, sometimes the law has issues and it's been through changes, but in general, like we have a system that we agree on, and we work from there to begin to cover stories. Now, when we don't have those basic value tenets that we agree on, things are getting a little tricky. It's harder to tell a story when you don't agree on basic values as a nation. Because we come from that place where it's like, this is good and this is a problem. But if we no longer know what is good and what is a problem, it really is hard to tell stories. Because you're coming from a place where, I'll give an example to make this a bit more concrete. At NPR, where the public radio station that I had to work at, what litigated for a while was the concept of climate change. There was a long period of time where the people in the media, in different parts of the media, wavered on whether and they still do, whether they accept that climate change is happening or not. And after a while, NPR has a whole ethics board. They go through all their whole thing about how they're going to tell the stories. And they came to the conclusion that they would tell the story from the perspective that climate change is real. And then we would work from whatever story we were working from that fact. But just to get to that place and then start to tell the story took a long time. Took years of America getting to a place where they were going to say, okay, that's what we're going to start with. And even now, it's of course still going back and forth and all that stuff's happening, but them taking that stance does shape your national identity, because then anybody who's listening comes from the perspective or begins to follow the perspective that is a thing. And then we have the discussion from there. Now, the debate about how you deal with it, how you fix it, that's not their job to tell you. But they have started from the fact that it is a thing. And so that's sort of the debate. And so in those ways, media does have a huge impact of shaping the national conversation. You even start thinking about where you start is huge.
We talked about this when we met before we recorded that, it is really frustrating to me that we can't even agree on basic facts. Whereas, 20, 30 years ago, the conversation used to be the issue on the table is taxes, and we are talking about, how much we want to tax what. Now, the conversation is, do we even want taxes? We're not even agreeing on the basic tenet of taxes make the country run anymore, and it's wild.
A really interesting time. And I think that is a process of kind of discovering what is the baseline here that we're starting from. We don't have that right now. And we're trying to get to that place. I think that we're going to see media evolve on that, on the baseline based on what's happening. Right. And it'll be interesting to see where we land. I don't know what that's going to be. I don't think anybody knows what that's going to be right now. Like you said, we don't have a baseline. We don't have a place to start.
And that's just a sign of the times, but also sad, I guess, is the best way that I would put it.
It's a hard way to report. It's a hard way to do journalism, to not have a baseline as a country. But I do feel like what we're seeing from some people is that they're just kind of leaning into where their audience's baseline is, which is interesting too. And so, because I think at one point there was a concept that media was a catch-all, but what we're seeing is that, there's your audience, and that might just be who you need to cater to. You're not going to catch everybody. And so, whoever is and that kind of goes back to maybe we end up with different understandings of what is happening in the country, because depending on who your readership is or who your audience is, you're going to have a different understanding of what's happening.
Right. So in recent crises, such as the pandemic, January 6th, wars abroad, like you mentioned, the war in Gaza, how do those narratives evolve based on how different media platforms present them?
I would say it's less about how the media platforms present them, and I think it's more about what the audience wants more of. And this is tricky, because it's like you're kind of, who comes first? Is it the media or the audience? It's a combination, in my opinion. I've seen this happen in real time. I just think about the war in Gaza. I think as that conflict evolved, people wanted the story to be told differently. It was a public who had an influence over how the media was telling the story. They would call stations, they would complain. I did a few analysis reports for ABC on the Gaza situation. And I remember one I did, it wasn't me, it was the host. The host made a comment. I'm not going to repeat the comment because I don't want any drama, but the host made a comment, and I received 50 plus emails and for weeks about this comment, and people were upset. And this type of thing really does influence how the media begins to respond to the crisis, how they report on the crisis. And so if you'll see people are saying, oh, they're too sympathetic to this group, or they're too sympathetic to that group, or this is true and this is not true. If the public riots, if the public responds, if the public's calling your boss's boss's boss, you're going to hear about it, and you're going to be influenced in some ways. And whether it's directly, and people say, oh no, they can't do that, blah, blah, that happens. It does happen. And so I do say it's kind of a back and forth depending on, what the story is, who has the power and influence. Sometimes that is real. That is a real situation that happens, and people do feel it. Whether they say it directly, you might be afraid to say certain things because of the backlash that you will receive. And so you may take it a different way, or you may try to report it. And, I do think people try to be the best they can in terms of covering those controversial issues, but you have to be aware that you're about to step into the flames. And so even when I did the analysis on Gaza, I was very careful. I was very careful because I'm about to get canceled either way.
That is an issue that I see it in myself. I don't really like to get too opinionated on it. One, because I don't feel like I know enough. I know enough to understand that people in Gaza are being killed, but it is a touchy subject where no matter which avenue you choose to take in handling it and covering it, somebody's going to be upset.
Someone's going to be upset. you unfollowed me or didn't like something I said. I was actually surprised, but I just know it's an inflammatory topic. So like in
Absolutely.
general, like you handle with your, do it at your own risk. But like I said, that does influence how people cover things, and you will see the media evolve on their coverage because of the response. And so like it is tricky because it's like, oh, are they changing blah 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 because it's something? Yeah, maybe.
Right. Well, I'm thinking specifically about January 6th, right after all the coverage was, this was awful, which it was. Full disclosure, my opinion is that it was awful. And then as Trump kind of evolved the narrative to be, oh, it was just a tourist group, it was just, whatever, the media kind of got a little bit soft on it and then got hard again once he pardoned all of them. And the public backlash was pretty evident. Like, that wasn't a popular policy for him to have. So I think the media finally got a backbone in that instance. But it was interesting to watch the evolution, especially on January 6th.
I will say on the January 6th, yeah, I do remember people being horrified. And it has evolved. And on that particular topic, I do think that in a sense, the media feels a need to respond to how they perceive the public is taking information. And it's weird because I'm not defending it because I fully don't understand, like, there's different types of languages. If you're watching MSNBC, they're still going to be tough. They're still going to be like, whatever, that's their audience and their audience accepts that. But does the New York Times go the same route? Does exactly. So you're looking at like these places where the audience does have a huge sway, and we don't know. And I won't pretend that people don't call people, or people don't have stories. People don't say, oh, like, let me talk to this guy, or maybe we don't want to get sued. Maybe we do this way because we don't want to get sued. Like, or we're more careful, or maybe, you're something gets, the story you're doing gets killed, and you're like, why? And it's like some way above your pay grade has a thought. So, these are interesting times. I will say, because I'm not going to defend them, because I do see like things that I'm disgusted by. Like, are we going to be, it is like, oh, what's happening? Right. Because what's happening with the lawsuits? What's happening with the payouts? What does all this mean? And those are like questions that I wish as someone who works in the media and really believes in the mission of holding the powerful accountable through the messaging, wish I knew I understood. I don't.
Right.
That's all. Those are above my pay grade. That's like the head of ABC and whoever, and whatever
Right.
station, and they're making decisions though, and that does impact the narrative, and it will trickle down to like, oh, that one reporter just cost us $30 million.
Bummer.
It's like your salary's not even close to that, but it's like,
right. So in situations where there are two or many conflicting truths, can collective memory survive that?
I think in our history, we have had that. We have had conflicting truths. I grew up as a Black woman in the South, in Texas, and I'll tell you, the history that I learned growing up is not the history I understand today. And so I grew up with a different understanding of who I was, people like me, what their contribution to this country was, than what I understand now. And so I do think that we grow up with conflicting understandings of U.S. history. Has that fractured even more at this time? Yes. And is it even more contentious? Yes. But it's always been pretty contentious. And so I will say, as someone who grew up in the South, grew up in Texas, had a different history, I would say, than I understand now. We have had different understandings of ourselves, different understandings of the populations within our country, their contributions, what they're hurting, what they're helping. We have had that. And there are opportunities still for us to have a collective sense of what an American should be, or what America should be. But I don't think it'll always be the same. And I don't think it has always been the same. And so just like with hindsight of, it feels heavy and it feels bad, but also we have had a fractured past. We had a civil war, right? And then we still came back, and we still, still have an America. Definitely not saying anything about civil war, but I'm saying that is something that we have seen in this country because of the fractured identity. Not possibility for civil war, but possibility that we can continue as a country with different understandings of ourselves and the people around us.
Right. And so when the truth does become subjective or more malleable, like we're seeing now, what does that mean for democratic institutions?
I do think you have to decide, as an individual, because I thought to myself, well, is there a way for people to figure it out for themselves? Like go through and figure out what's true and what's not true. We're lazy. I'm not going to do that. We're not going to do that every time. We're going to try our best sometimes. We're like what the things we're really passionate with, but we're still taking in a lot of misinformation every day. And even if it's active or passive, it's happening. And it's influencing the way we see the world and our responses to it. I think that what's going to have to happen going forward is that we're going to have to decide which entities we're going to trust and which ones we're not, and move from there. So I do think that people should find a verifiable source that they can trust and rely on, because let's be real, you're going to be lazy and you can't go back as journalism is a full-time job. And so not everyone could just do it. And so, finding that source that you trust and is going to give you generally reliable sources. People make mistakes. It's human. It's a human run system. That's okay. I do think in terms of government, what we're going to see is a drop, which is going to be interesting. I just saw a Pew Research study that said that Republicans actually increase their reliability on news media, which I thought was really interesting in the last few years. And so I said, oh, that's in the last year, that's really interesting, because over time that's been dropping. But what we do see is when people know people, for example, the local media has maintained a steady trust record with Americans. Surveys show that. Pew Research has shown that. Different types of surveys have shown that. So, more than national media, even though it's louder, local media is pretty reliable. And I think it's because you see us, you see people, you see your local reporter, that person, that person's not malicious or, they're not part of the, Illuminati or whatever you think it is. I think that helps. I think that reporters do need to be more part of the community and do need to show themselves as more of part of the country. And that balance will help build the trust that they need in the fourth estate. Now, in terms of the other parts of government, I think we're going to have a rough path ahead, because
Right.
we're looking at is data being destroyed. We, especially in the media, I think it's going to be particularly hard because I'm a data nerd. And so I'm very much if you look at most of my stories, there's some stat from the federal government, but there's still local stats that you can pull. But they're for those national stories, getting those national statistics, when we see those things being purged, that's going to be concerning and difficult for people to navigate, because it's how are we going to collect data now? What language are we using? I have a friend who works at the EPA. They were telling me that they're redefining they're redefining what is water. So when I know it was H2O, but they're so when you take statistics and you say, oh, this is what this means, and then you change what the word means, and then you change how you collect the statistics, how can you use it? It's very tricky. Right. And so that's going to be a hard thing to get over, is all of these changes and what they actually mean, and that verifiable source will be for people. I think that's going to be a rough road ahead.
Well, and I actually can't even get into that. It's infuriating because the consequences of the things that we're seeing now, a lot of them will not hit until well after Donald Trump is out of office. And then it will be blamed on whoever's in office at the time that those consequences come to be. And go on.
No, it's a real, these are real repercussions that you see over time. And I think this is something that's always interesting, because a lot of people oh, this person changed office, and then this happened, but it's sometimes the first Trump administration, I will say, when I worked at the State Department, I worked at the transition between Trump and Biden, and we didn't change any activities. We just changed what we called them. So I don't know if that's the thing. It was I literally remember somebody saying, Biden is here now. Is there anything that you're doing that we can call human rights? Okay. This is what we're already doing. We can call it human rights now.
So interesting.
So, in terms of internal government behaviors and what the changes actually are happening, it's really interesting to kind of see what actually does change and what actually doesn't change, or what people are kind of just shuffling around. It's a lot under administration changes. Shuffle, relabel. new label for this one.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting, because the way Trump always labels he doesn't call it American supremacy, but I can't think of what he calls it. American supremacy, under Biden, that was just diplomacy.
I don't think there's any American president who operated the government in a way that did not push American Americans first.
Yeah, no, 100%.
So, like, because the government is designed to survive, and our government in particular is designed to rule. And so, under every administration, you might be being nice about it, or you might be using pretty words about it, but like, there's no proposal that I would do at the State Department that would fly if it has some negative thing that would impact us,
Right.
just in case.
The biggest, like, holy shit moment I had in my master's degree was my concentration in my master's degree was diplomacy and policy formation. So I took a bunch of like diplomacy classes, which were focused around the State Department. The biggest mind-blowing thing I learned was like, we are a propaganda machine. And, they don't frame it as being propaganda, like, Voice of America, like America House. That's propaganda, but we don't call it that anymore. And it's, it's serving out a purpose that eventually helps and protects Americans. But I just thought that was the funniest thing where I was like, oh my God, we're still doing the propaganda that never died.
And they're in the way they would describe it, VOA, because I don't want the VOA people to be mad because they wouldn't call it. I know them, so they're like mad. But they say VOA was designed that way to push American ideology to the world. They cover the news. I would say they cover it there. They do their due diligence. But of course, even in doing things from your perspective, you're pushing your perspective. So at the end of the day, that's, you're going into, communist China and you're talking about Uyghurs, right? This is something that we would cover as Americans. We would think that, oh yeah, that's, what's happening with the Uyghurs. We don't want them to not have their rights or, not be free. But that's American propaganda to China. And, so it is complicated because you're like, I'm just, a Voice of America reporter will just tell you, I'm just doing my job. And they probably are. I don't work there, but, I do believe that that's like, they are journalists, they are doing their job. But of course, part of the design of the creation of it was this idea of spreading American ideologies. So
it was just like actually the funniest thing to me. I was like, this is kind of awesome. I'm like,
and
the class name could have changed from like public diplomacy to just propaganda in America today.
It's true. I personally am not anti-American ideologies.
I'm not either. I just thought it was so funny.
In my mind, I'm like, okay, I would say like I did public relations for the State Department. So I mean, it was a lot to reconcile with, sometimes because you're also, part of it is just like pushing those American ideologies, and then part of it is like you're mowing over people, like whatever. Like but it's very complicated. It is like you're telling people like, oh, you're reconciling with yourself as an individual because you're saying, okay, how do I talk about this very controversial thing, or how do I begin to formate this conversation? Ideally, you would want your own government to look good, but it's like, should you think about that? Is just telling the truth enough for that? And in the sense of the idea the ability to even criticize your own government.
Right. So you talked a little bit about misinformation, which is also a hot topic in the decade. What are the long-term kind of consequences of truth fatigue or misinformation overload, especially for younger people?
I think it leaves us really vulnerable as a country, not being able to understand what is real, what is not real, being divided over things that are not actually things that are happening. Or we saw it a lot with the Ukraine war in Russia. Right. There was a lot of propaganda that happened. Like people were saying they were persecuting Jews, which is weird because Zelensky's was Jewish. There was a lot of misinformation, and I don't want to quote Ms. Zelensky and say what his religious practices are, but I remember there was a lot of misinformation that was already taking place amongst the public, and that allowed for the public to support or not support things that probably they may or may not have supported otherwise. And so, what we're seeing is when we don't know what's true or what's not true, we find ourselves inflamed about things that might not be what is happening. We find ourselves angry at our neighbors, people that we normally would not be angry at, because we don't know what's actually going on. And I do think we're in a stage where we're almost being played with in a sense of like what's going on. And, the level of misinformation that goes into inflammatory behaviors that can lead people to kill, which is happening, lead people to attack, lead people to, do terrible things to one another. It's real and it's happening. And I think we're actually, crossing that bridge. I think there was an organization that they used to only work overseas, and their goal is to stop political violence. I think it's called Common Ground. And they started working in the US during the last election because of the political violence that was taking place. And that is inflamed by misinformation. And it's both on the left and the right. Let's be real. Like people say, oh my God, this happens. And we're pissed. We're pissed. I'm pissed. Because if you don't have time to read all of it, you're like, oh, did I just see this happen? I'm pissed. And also, like, sometimes you don't even want to read all of it because it's like, this is too much. And it's like, just like a bunch of negative things coming at you at once. And so you find yourself angry. Like when you become this constant state of angry, people's minds start working in all kinds of ways. I hear people, like, if you go to the far, actually, you don't have to go that far anymore in the internet, and you'll start seeing people talk about like all kinds of things, like violence, things like violent behaviors and actions that they want to take, or they're inviting other people to take. We're a place with a lot of guns, and so people are having those conversations online. And I remember my friends used to send it to me, and I was like, this is extreme. And she was like, no, this is all the time.
I like that you pointed out that it's on the left and the right, because my mother, if she listens to this, she's going to be really upset. She's now turned to, she'll text me and say, is this one true? And I'm like, okay, Google's free, but for you, I'll figure it out. But she like accounts like those popular left-wing influencers, Jojo from Jers and the other 98%, like where they'll post stories. And again, they have some thread of truth to them typically.
Usually
they're often very exaggerated to get your emotions heightened about it. And it is really frustrating.
Right.
Because then we're sat there having to Google and verify, like and I understand it's social media. We've been taught for years and years and years, don't believe everything you read on the internet, but it seems like that has gone straight out the window at this point.
It's hard. Let's be real. Like your mom probably has a job. She has you. She has other things to think about. I'm thinking about myself. Like I got kids. I'm going to spend all day verifying every single story. Unless I'm reporting on it, no, I'm not going to verify every single story. And my job is information. And so it's hard. It is incredibly hard for people to just go through and say, I'm going to read every single story. And it's also for their mental health. People aren't trying to do that. And so these people try to dose how much they take in. And so, that process of, I read a story this morning and I was like, oh, are we I think the headline was, something about a bunch of houses are for sale in Washington, D.C. And, nobody's buying houses anymore or whatever. And then if you read the story, there was like a big chunk of it that says, but the data is still coming, so we're not exactly sure where it's going to go, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, this is nullifying your entire headline. Like if I had just read the headline, I kept going on with my life, which normally I would do that with that type of story because I'm not invested that much into that kind of story. It's like I would be believing that the housing market is crashing in DC.
Right.
But you guys don't even have enough data. You just wrote a headline for clicks. And this was part of my disillusionment with a lot of media, was that click rabbit hole that was designed to make you angry in design and emotion. People just thought they could put anything on a headline as long as the information inside was okay. They were like, oh, we'll make sure the story is okay, but somebody else does the headline. And that person is a professional headline person.
Right.
Headline person is missing that. Most people don't even read the story. They just read the headline.
Well, that's my dad loves Fox News, just for starters.
You have a good family combination.
Oh, yeah. But he will often send my mom and I screenshots of Fox News articles, and the headline is always something ridiculous. And I'm like, okay, well, and he doesn't even send the whole article. First of all, he screenshots just the headline. And I'm like, okay, first of all, can you send the link? Second of all, if you are reading that and getting emotional at just the headline, that shouldn't be happening when you consume news or media. That's not a normal thing to feel.
Honestly, that's part of the reason why I'm a public media person, because I'm like that. And then for a second, they even went into that clickbait stuff. Like I think they veered back away from it, which I'm thankful for. But for a second, they were like, oh, we're going to try to clickbait. And I was like, that's a bad idea. I'm a public media person because I don't like my emotions to be overwhelmed with the situation. I remember during the Hillary Trump election, it was like they were literally, CNN had like a boxing match, and it was like and I was like, extra, like they're not really hitting each other. The way it was imagery and everything felt like you were fighting people, and I was like, this is too much for me. This is not how I want to consume my media. I don't want to be inflamed. I don't want to be enraged. I just want to know what's happening. And so I kind of choose based on that. I don't want you to make me extra feel feelings.
So we are living in an era where there is not a whole lot of trust between the public and the media. What responsibility do you think journalists, educators, creators have in helping rebuild that trust?
I think the media needs to be viable. I don't think they'll have a viable model without trust. Everything is based on the ability for someone to open what you wrote, and your job is information. And so the integrity of your information is the most important part of your job. And so my general belief on that is that you need to do whatever possible to get people to trust you. Whether that means, and I've seen this work, at least, some people might not like the New York Times, but they'll like that one reporter, or they'll like that one person. And I do think that ability to be the human in the space does stand out and does draw people to you. And so I used to do this thing where I would tweet my story sometimes when I was more on Twitter. And I would also show how I got to the story. I would also show the things I couldn't put in the story, the people that I interviewed. I would go through and show kind of the process of me getting there, because I wanted to offer that transparency to whoever was following me, so that I could build that trust with the audience. Because I know how I grew up not trusting the media. Shoot, like I'm from Texas, and I used to be like, oh no, the media is that. So it was a kind of weird that I actually ended up working there, but.
And then you were the media. How does that feel?
But it was really, that's why I feel like I'm extra conscious about the trust, because I know that especially communities like where I come from feel like shot by the media. They feel like you don't get the narrative. They feel like you don't care about the narrative. Right. They feel like you're doing something else, and they don't know, and they don't get why it's the way it is. And so what I used to do was kind of go that extra effort and say like, okay, I'm doing this story on X or Y, or I would involve people, if you want to talk about it, help me, to do this, let me talk to these experts, or let me show you how I got to this story. What was missing in the data that I found? Where did I find this data? Why was I looking here? Why is this a topic that we're even talking about right now? Right. Those are things that I can say as a journalist, and I can say why I published this story because I chose those stories. Right. Or sometimes sometimes it was assigned to me, and or sometimes a tip came through or whatever. And those are things that you can say. There's nothing wrong with that transparency in that process if somebody's willing to listen. And anybody who's willing to listen is somebody who you can convert to having trust, and it's worth having that conversation. So yeah. I think that some media entities are trying to be more transparent. They're trying to show like why they do it that way, trying to answer those. They'll put it on their websites and stuff like that. And I think that does offer help. And I think there is a trust in media, whole organization dedicated to helping media organizations build trust with constituencies and their audiences. And I think that is helpful. I think taking time is helpful, not having as many mistakes, because people don't have time to go back and read your corrections. And if they can't rely on what you give them the first time, that's really going to be detrimental to you as a source of information for them. So, but I understand people make mistakes. Like, I don't want to be harsh on my colleagues because I've made mistakes. People make mistakes. I think it's necessary. You don't have a model if you don't have trust.
Right. Well, and I feel like it's even more compounded by the fact that these bigger parent companies are starting to buy up our major newspapers that everybody knows and loves. And we're starting to see the ramifications of that, but especially in the lawsuits. But, I feel like they need to double time it now. And one, you should trust us, for being a source, but two, you need to trust us in spite of the fact that our parent company is big brothering us right now.
That whole thing, these are network things that those are definitely above my pay grade in some ways.
Right.
Those type of decisions and what comes out of those decisions, I think people should just know what they're looking at. If I read all of it. I read MSNBC, I read Fox. I just know what I'm looking at. But part of the reason is I want to know what I'm looking at. I want to know what those audiences want, or what masters that be perceive those audiences want to hear. Because those are, and I get those examples because they're one stratosphere and the other stratosphere. And so it's kind of what are they seeing when they cover that same story? And how are they covering it? And why is it done that way? And, just know what you're looking at. I think that's the thing. You're going to take information from a bunch of different places, know what it is, and know what you're looking at.
Right. In your view, what kind of media literacy or civic education efforts could actually make a difference in combating disinformation?
There are, in other countries, they have State Department used to fund this too, like disinformation in different countries, like dealing with how to teach media literacy as a course. I think Finland like rolled it out throughout all their students because for them Russia is such a real threat, and so they want their students guarded. They want their population guarded against bad information. We haven't decided how we want to handle this as a country. I recently went to a congressional hearing on this topic about censorship. And, the way the conservative side says it is that the left is censoring them, in a sense that they're looking at it like, at one point, Biden had this whole disinformation team and apparatus inside the government. And, there's a lot of debate if the government should have a say in what's true or what's not true, right? Because even if you thought like Biden did the right thing with that, if that group was still available under Trump, would you still think that? Right? That's all. These are all real questions. Like, who should be that? And I remember the consensus. There was a lot of complaints about like even the nonpartisan content watchers. There's a lot of nonpartisan content watching groups, and they'll tell you, oh, this is good, this is not good. The content's high quality, it's low quality. And they have these ratings that they give, but people sue about those ratings. People sue about the content watchers. People are pissed about the content watchers. They say that they're silencing exploits or whatever, and the content watchers will tell you that's not true. Like we have conservatives, we have liberals, we're nonpartisan, and so you have to. It's a lot to sift through, and it's still being debated as to. Is it a nonprofit content watcher that's going to tell us who's good or not? Is it the government who's going to do the disinformation, teaching a lot? I think schools could play a huge role in teaching disinformation. News literacy is what we usually call it, right? Just being able to, and I would generally call it information literacy at this point because, it's beyond news. You just need to know how to understand information from anywhere because you're going to get it from all kinds of sources. And so, there's also the educational component and high quality information, low quality information, high quality content, low quality content, because they don't call it like bad. They call it high quality, low quality generally. And so, but there is a lot of debate, and there's also litigation, right? So like technically I can sue you if you lie about me, if you generate some random fake AI thing. Is it the court's job to filter our information for us? Do I need to take it to court? And then we decide from there. These are still being debated. It's not concluded. This is something that I when I went to the congressional hearing, I was really fascinated to kind of see like what that discussion was, because I was kind of thinking, what is the solution? And there is, at the moment, what we have is a litigation system. You have some educators in schools, not enough funding, and then you have, of course, individual people who care about news literacy, not enough.
Right, and like I mentioned earlier, we were, at least when I was a kid. By the time I was in 3rd or 4th grade, like we didn't have personal computers, but we had like access to computers to like write papers or whatever. And, they taught us use reliable sources. Don't go to, don't use Wikipedia because anybody can write on it. Like they tried the best with what they knew at the time, but unfortunately it just wasn't comprehensive enough. And even now, like hasn't evolved to keep up with what we know now.
Right. Because even you have AI, like there was a report from the American Sunlight Project, and they were talking about how, Russian influencers were trying to feed our AI systems with information. And that's like a whole nother thing, right? That's because if you're just generating information from AI, which is, you don't know necessarily always the sources. They do have sometimes like sources that I think they're trying to get better with their sources in terms of, I have seen like them trying to like do that. They also need as much information as they can get. And so it's not always, even now they're becoming publishers. And so it's like, oh, how are they filtering their publishing? If you're giving somebody an answer, where'd that answer come from? Are people checking those answers? People are lazy, man. And it's like, I'm lazy sometimes. So like, I'll just put that like, like we are moving 100 miles an hour, overworked half the time, trying to keep up, always trying to do more and never keeping up. And so our general apparatus is overwhelming. And so I don't blame people for not going through that deep into the rabbit hole and being like, did a Russian bot give me this answer from this AI content thing? Who knows? But this is the current system that we're in, and it's overwhelming for a lot of people. I think that we're going to go through a lot of creative destruction, if that makes sense. They call the process of like things that are coming that are new, but destroying things that are old before we get to a place of settlement.
Right. My biggest gripe with AI is that it doesn't acknowledge when it doesn't know something. So instead of saying I don't know, it'll make some, it makes something up.
Well, it has a knowledge base. And I actually made an AI chatbot myself because I was going through a weird process of trying to figure out if I could use AI to enhance news and information consumption. And so I was, and I'm like a crazy person like that. And so I was like, okay, let me see how I can use it. And so I went through the process of figuring out how to create an AI chatbot or whatever to use. And essentially what it is trained to do is it has this knowledge base and it's trained to generate answers from that knowledge base. And so no matter what you put there, it's going to give you something from that knowledge base that you don't have.
Right.
And it's annoying.
Right.
Like,
well, but then again, it goes back to your point of like people don't check things. So it could spit something out and you as the person who asked the question are none the wiser because they spit it out.
Exactly, because it just made something up from whatever somebody put in there.
Right, exactly.
And it's like, and they're changing their knowledge bases all the time, which is interesting. So like, we don't even, that's
right. Well, I feel like this is the perfect transition to start talking about your book, The Herd, When Democracy Falls. Yeah. Where can somebody theoretically go and purchase that book?
So it is on Amazon, also on my website. If you wanted me, I do sign copies from my website. Also, if you wanted to do Ingram Spark, they also have it as well. And so it's for independent book publishers. And so it's all on those places now, looking to distribute it further. And I'd say like next month. So hopefully it'll be everywhere then.
Okay. And all of that will be linked in the show notes. It was a great book. I literally sat down and read it. I think I got home from work at about 6. I had responded to your email. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to get it on my Kindle. I bought it on my Kindle and I sat down and read it until probably like 10:30. Like it was a quick read, to be quite honest with you. And I sat down and read it in once.
Yes, okay.
But the book does paint a world where disinformation has eroded the very root and foundation of society. What inspired you to write this story now?
So truthfully, I wrote this story 5 years ago. And I feel like part of the reason why I was like, this has to be published now is because I saw like things I had written 5 years ago coming to life. And that was really crazy for me. I was working in news at that time. That was right before I joined the State Department when I first started the book. And I was incredibly disillusioned with what I was seeing, with what we were doing internally as media organizations. Not necessarily with just my news organization. I was fine with that per se at that time, but I've been through a few and I continued to see how we were operating internally. And that really bothered me. It bothered me that we were sacrificing information integrity for clicks. That to me was not the service, not the reason I got into that job. I wrote my master's thesis on democratizing information because I grew up in a space where I didn't understand the system and I didn't understand what was happening. And I thought that put a lot of disadvantages for me as an individual. It made it harder for me to hold public officials accountable. I didn't understand what was happening around me in the society that I was in. And that to me was a huge disadvantage growing up. And so when I thought, what can I give people that can give them power, that people who don't have power, it's information to me. And so high quality information, as they call it, was super important to me. But what I was watching and I thought to myself, the best way to do it was through journalism. So I didn't study journalism, my thought process was education. But they call journalism the largest school of continuing education is the news media. And I thought, okay, well, I can do this through journalism. And so I went into this field looking to democratize information so that we could hold people accountable to the public that they were serving. And I didn't see that happening sometimes. That was discouraging. And so I wanted to process what was happening. But I thought that fiction might be a way to do that in a way that I couldn't do it through just a book. I wanted it to be fiction because I thought I wanted to create something entertaining to have a hard conversation. Right. I had been doing a lot of news stories at that time. And also I thought fiction was another avenue for this because I did feel like at that time people were overwhelmed with the news stories, the way the news stories were being done. And so it's like, do you want to preach at people and like preach at them about your facts or whatever, or how you're feeling? Or do you want to allow them to enjoy something and then come to their own conclusions?
Right. Fiction generally is a little bit more of an emotional read. And I think, getting people, I mean, we just talked about like the headlines that make you emotional. Reading a book that makes you emotional is going to make you think a little bit deeper about the broader themes and implications of what you're reading, because it's especially in fiction books that aren't like fantasy based, where they're feasibly in some universe could happen. It does make you think,
right? The speculative fiction section, and I kind of love it too. I'm also obsessed. Like, I read speculative fiction all day. I went to go see 1984 on Broadway. I'm like a different kind of human, and so like
right.
I do love that. I do love that genre that allows you to not have to deal with the actualities, but still makes you think about what's actually happening.
Right. Well, that's what, like, I almost never read fiction books, but my favorite fiction books are the ones that are like dystopian realities, which, like, I don't know what that says about my psyche, but like I love when the world has crumbled and the main character has to figure everything out. Like, that's my jam.
I mean, I feel like it says that you like to think about the world around you in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good assessment. So for people that read your book, what do you hope that all readers take away about truth, trust, and civic responsibility?
I think we should think about how hard it is. One of the things that, and I'm not trying not to give it away, but just kind of thinking about like how hard it is to actually rebuild what is broken. And what we're looking at is, I think that's going to be, that's a theme that I have been thinking about too, is I'm even writing the second book. So I'm going through that process of like, is there a solution for such a fractured society? In the book, we have this society where everyone has fractured. They've gone into the worst parts of the most extremes of their ideologies, and they no longer have the institutions of trust. They don't have that anymore. They don't believe in it anymore. And so when you're in that space, what do you rebuild in its place? How do you do that? Trust is hard to build. Think about trust with your friend. Like, if you lose trust in your friend, maybe your friend, I don't know, sleeps with your boyfriend or some random thing. Like, just like, you think about like trust as an entity is so hard. And it's something that we should value so much, and something that we should care for so much. And so if we lose that trust, what happens? And so part of it is like the public, thinking about the institutions that we have and how much we should guard those, because it is almost impossible to rebuild. And then also talking to the media itself about, do you realize what you have? Are you willing to sacrifice that for money, for ratings, for clicks? Think, what is the weight of what you're doing for the country? Right. And like that kind of process of just, process it. How do we maintain that trust? How do we keep that thing that is so difficult to build?
Yeah, that's, again, I loved the book. It made me think about, and I think it's fascinating and funny that you wrote it 5 years ago, and like here I am reading it in 2025, and I'm like, and that sounds familiar, and that sounds familiar.
This is my friend. She was like, "Oh my God, you're like a prophet," and I was like, "Well, don't say that. I'm not trying to make a cult," but I totally like felt like it did feel like I was looking at something like a train crash coming. And because I'm in the inside and that's my job, I'm media, but I'm also in DC. And it's also like this, it's like this space where it's just so heavy and everything feels like it's crashing on you. And you're watching you're watching how all these actors work together. And it's like, oh my God, it's a train wreck.
Right. 100%.
And so I was like, let's see what happens. Let's create this like world where the train wreck does happen and see what's going on. Because that's what we are train wreck.
Yeah. Well, it was a good book for anybody listening. I do recommend you go and read it. It'll definitely give you a lot to think about. And that is all I have for you, Jenny. Do you have anything else that you feel like I might have missed?
No. I mean, I think that, we talked a lot about this whole information apparatus that we're a part of. And I really, I'm hoping, we did talk a little bit about like the different generations and how we're all kind of trying to wade through it. I'm trying to be cautiously optimistic that we can hold ourselves together through this process and hopefully not live the dystopian future that I have written about in this book.
Right. It's really interesting. A lot of, especially in the last month of people that I've recorded with, a lot of the people have been saying I'm cautiously optimistic about what comes next. And I'm like, I'm really proud of you for thinking that. I don't feel that way, but I'm proud of you.
No, I'm not. I'm forcing myself to be. I'm forcing myself.
I try to make myself be as glass half full as possible, but come on, it's grim. It's grim out there.
I mean, mean, I work in news, so it can be very, very dark. And so I talk to who I need to talk to process and to go through that and say, like that process is like, try to like take it step by step, find maybe our system isn't meant to be the way it is before. Maybe it needs to be something different. And maybe that's part of the process is, something like I mentioned before, that creative destruction. I think that's part of like what I've been processing with the second book is just like maybe something destroys and we don't get that back again. We get something different. And maybe that's what we need.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered. I feel like Jenny has such a breadth of knowledge, and the conversation with her was super engaging for me, but I also feel like I left learning a lot. I think the media is something that people love to hate without really knowing what goes into it. And on top of that, it's a job that typically does not have a lot of money into it. So people go into it for the love of journalism, not because they want to make a fat check. And I feel like that's something that just really is not understood by the masses. Jenny's book that she put out, as I mentioned over and over again, was a really great and easy read. So I really hope that you guys take the time to go and read it and sit with me as we wait for book number 2 in the series. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use this information. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and keep believing in the truth. I'll see you guys next week in the briefing room.